Pastor Brian has my laptop there. And Pastor Brian, if you could just show everyone the sticker that's on the front of that laptop that my daughter Reagan put on there. It says ADHD, which is what I'm known for. And what's interesting about that I Can Only Imagine movie is one of my best friends who's here, Brian Ernst. He was with me from the point where I got that first initial script to we got the first director's cut. And so shout out to Brian Ernst, because he was really involved in helping us out with that one too, even though he didn't get his name on there. And the biggest problem I think that we had with that film was the fact that for a secular audience, this idea of radical forgiveness and radical reconciliation makes absolutely zero sense. So the one role that I tried to play as a producer was, how do you make sense of that? How do you take someone that's a monster and get somebody to forgive him? And I will, like all frustrated producers, tell you a killer scene I had that got cut. But I was at the beginning of the film, you know how they're at the camp? And for people who saw it, there's a young Bart at the camp, and he meets his future wife at the camp. And it's clear that he doesn't know much about the church, and she definitely comes from a family that takes the church seriously, and they are by a tree. And she says, oh, I love this camp, but I got so homesick the first time I got here. He said, why'd you get homesick? And she said, well, my dad used to read to me every night. And this was the first time he didn't read to me, so I would always come out by this tree, because the book he always read to me was The Giving Tree. And he goes, what's that book about? And he goes, oh, it's about a tree and a boy that are best friends, and then one day the tree lets the boy climb its branches, and then the tree lets the boy sell its apples, and then the tree lets him build the branches to make a boat so that he can travel somewhere, until finally the tree is just a stump, and the old man comes back dejected, and the tree says, I have nothing left to give you. And he goes, I just need a place to sit down. And the tree was happy to do it. And Bart looks at her and he goes, why would somebody give up everything to somebody who didn't deserve it? That doesn't make any sense. And so I thought that that was the perfect gateway to the gospel for people that had never heard it. And I think that that's the key thing that we need to do as believers, is find ways to explain to people that we believe in a rabbi that died 2,000 years ago, was unemployed, lived with his mother, and came back from the dead 3 days later. And it's not an easy thing to do, especially in the land of know-it-alls in New England. And so what I wanted to do was, if it's okay with you guys, I wanted to do a very quick speed round just to sort of explain to you the state of the business, show you some of the movie clips I have from some of our films, and then answer any questions that you guys might have. And obviously cannot continue without thanking the Stubblebines, who from day one have been an unbelievable support for me. And so huge shout out to those guys. And I say this empirically, this is no nepotism or favoritism, but their daughters are among the most talented filmmakers I've ever seen. And I got an email from their mom, and she said, what camp should I send my daughters to this year? And I said, you mean to teach at? And she said, no, to learn at. I was like, they know more than the instructors. They can't, they've run out. It's almost like we're at the point now where a lot of these places, it's the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and Christians didn't, go to camps to find out how to build a better printing press. They got to know Scripture. They got to understand storytelling, and they left building the devices up to other people, and they learned how to use that. And what are the delivery methods we can use with this now? What are the ways that we can tell this story? And so that's why I encouraged their mom. I was like, they're ready to go. just release them into the wild and let them, or run their own camp. But if we could just go to the next slide. This is the NFL Combine, which recently happened in the last couple of weeks. Are there any football fans here? Raise your hands if you're a football fan. As you can see, these are the world's best college football athletes. You have to be invited to go there. One incredibly inspiring thing that happened this year was there was a gentleman there with only one arm, and he had the best time and set another record in weightlifting, and he's probably going to be a first-round draft pick this year. First person with one arm to ever make it into the NFL. But these are the people that you're dealing with. And then if you go to the next slide, you have Netflix. Their market cap is $88 billion, and they have 110 million subscribers. It's now 118 million. Their programming budget is $6 billion. Now here's an interesting fact about Netflix that they don't like to talk about. Last year, they lost $2 billion. So despite the fact that they dominate and that they're everywhere and they've really made things difficult for us producers, they haven't exactly cracked the code either. And then if we go to the next slide, we have Amazon, which is subsidized by all of their other businesses. Their market cap is 55 trillion, or who knows where Jeff Bezos is at now. They have 90 million subscribers. Out of that, 30 million people use the video service. They're spending about $4.5 billion a year in programming and also losing money. And then the final slide, Hulu, you've probably read a lot about. They don't disclose their numbers because they're a private company, but my former head of development is now the head of Hulu, and he told me that they had their biggest year of growth. They went from 14 million subscribers to 17 million subscribers, and they lost $1 billion. So people are having a very difficult time trying to figure out how to make this business work and how to make money at it. And that's where I think that as believers, we are going to be the people who figure it out. It's not going to be something that comes from inside the industry, and it's not going to be people who are already calcified into a certain way of thinking. And so I want to show you a picture of another person from the NFL Combine. Does that look like the kind of person that you would want to draft to run your football team when you've seen everyone else up there? That's a gentleman from Michigan who was the third string quarterback for his freshman high school team, barely made his high school football team, then eventually worked his way up and got a scholarship to the University of Michigan, and the New England Patriots took a chance on him, and that's Tom Brady. And that's what he looked like at the NFL Combine. And so how could somebody look at him and say he's going to be the greatest athlete of all time? And if we go to the slide, as believers, we're familiar with that as well, because we all know, and non-believers know the story of Goliath as well, that nobody could touch Goliath. And everybody was always looking for who could be as big and as strong to outwit and outmatch Goliath. And so they went to Jesse's sons, if we go to the next slide, and they looked through all of them, and they're like, nope, nope, nope. There's got to be someone else. And there's like, well, there's David, but he's a scrawny little kid, and he just takes care of the sheep. They're like, that's the guy. He's the guy that's going to beat Goliath. And everyone said, you got to be kidding me. And they're like, well, you guys look on the outside. That's not where God looks. God looks on the inside. That's what matters to God. So then when we go to the next slide, Stubblebine girls, you can appreciate this, and anyone that has older brothers and sisters can appreciate this. This is the great, gentle greeting that David's older brothers met him with. Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. Nothing like great support from your family when you're down there trying to help things out. So then we go to the next slide. if we can. And okay, I doubled up there. And then David gave his great response. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And that was what was interesting was the Irwins had a movie that came out that was supposed to do gigantic business. It was called Woodlawn, and it was a football movie. And it completely underperformed, and it didn't make its money back, and they were heartbroken. And the gentleman that owned Chick-fil-A, who are the Kathy family, they're legit. Everything you read about them is true. They are great Christian people. They had a conference for a dozen of us or so just to go down to talk to each other. And I said, I think God's using this to remind you that you can't do this by your own industry or your own initiative. You have to be completely obedient to God. And so the predictions were the movie would make $1 million this weekend, and it made $17 million this weekend. And so I said, what's interesting is it's weekend one, and you made $17 million. And one of my favorite passages is James 1:17, every good and perfect gift comes from above. So as people start to write articles about what geniuses you guys are, please remember 1:17, God could not make it any more obvious about where this gift has come from. And then we'll see, I think, is there another slide after this one? The way that, how did David beat Goliath, by the way? Show of hands. Faith. And what, was it a right uppercut? Did he have a bigger javelin? A sling and a stone. How many stones? 5 stones. Why 5?
He had brothers.
How many?
Probably 4 more.
He had 4 brothers. So one of the little known facts that I love about David that proves that he's Irish is he was so cocky and he loved to fight so much that not only was he confident that he could take down Goliath, he went up to Goliath and said, when you're done, I'm going to take down your whole family with nothing but my faith in the Lord and these 5 rocks. And there's a great writer who a lot of you are probably familiar with called Malcolm Gladwell. And Malcolm Gladwell is a Christian, and he writes popular books like The Tipping Point and several other books about psychology and behavioral economics. And so he decided, I wonder if there's any truth to this David and Goliath thing in real life. So he decided that he would classify David and Goliath battle as anything where people were outnumbered by 50-1 odds or greater. And what he found out was Goliath wins 80% of the time. However, when David uses an unconventional means, like bringing a slingshot to a knife fight, David wins 90% of the time. If you look up at the screen here, you'll see a boxer that everyone thought could not be defeated. His name was Mike Tyson. And people were petrified of him. There are pictures you can look at the internet of people just trembling with fear before the fight. Buster Douglas lost his mother 2 weeks before this fight began. And after losing his mother, he said, I have nothing left to be scared of anymore. I've seen the worst that life has to offer, and I'm certainly not going to be scared of this guy. So Buster Douglas was the first person to ever run out of his corner and take the first swing at Mike Tyson, and he beat him. Then if we go to the next slide, that is Dr. J. Julius Erving from the University of Massachusetts. And he dominated in college just like he dominated at the Philadelphia 76ers. And there was a team in Fordham that was completely outmatched by 50-1 odds, and they destroyed UMass. And the reason they did was they did something that no other college team had ever done, which was the full court press. And the people in UMass did not know what to do against this. There was a freshman on that team, the UMass team, that saw that and said, I think I'm going to try that one day if I ever become a coach, and that was Rick Pitino. And then if we go to the next slide, this is where we're at right now with home video revenue, okay? So home video revenue is at 11 billion. It has eclipsed the box office for the first time ever. The box office is at 10 billion. However, that 11 billion, that is the lowest number since 1979. So people are not buying content anymore. We continue to spend a lot of money on content, and people cannot figure out a way to monetize it. That was just an interesting quote from the Today Show, where this guy, half of his hair is pink and half of his hair is purple. And this is my favorite review that we ever got. And in his review he wrote, "Let me be the first to admit the very idea of Walden Media, he hates it. It's owned by billionaire Philip Anschutz, who's given lots of money to the Republican Party and to anti-gay causes. Add to that fact mega-rich Christian conservative films, and all my warning buzzers go off. So how is it that I become a big fan of Walden Media's films?" Then if you go to the next slide, it helps certainly to become one of the most consistent sources. They're not movies that underestimate young viewers. Children contend with poverty. Families aren't always a source of security. Characters die. And given Anschutz's stated agenda for the company, it's relieving to note that Walden movies don't feel like a trip to Sunday school. Yes, the Christian metaphors make it into the Narnia movies, which they didn't into Wrinkle in Time, which is why that movie is suffering, but not in a way that beats you over the head. Next slide. Films feature bright, outspoken, courageous young female characters who are excellent role models for girls. Now, this is a case of how quickly things can change in Hollywood. I'm on the O'Reilly Factor. My friend Laura Ingram is co-hosting that night. And I'm on with my co-producer, a gentleman by the name of Harvey Weinstein, who is the most powerful producer in all of Hollywood. And we made a movie called The Giver. And I wanted to emphasize the pro-life messages in The Giver. And also wanted to emphasize the fact that Christianity was banned there. So we played Silent Night at the end. And we had some powerful people, and again, let's treat this like an accountability group. We don't repeat this outside the room, but some people, and names will rhyme with Beryl, Neep, and Naylor, Rift, and other people that were in that movie, they did not like those scenes, and they wanted them out of there. And it was Harvey Weinstein who had my back and defended the final cut and let me keep all those things in there. So it is amazing in terms of the kinds of people that God uses. If you go to the next slide, this is just, we're all familiar with this in terms of how often people go to church compared to how often they watch television video. And go to the next slide. And this just shows you, which is kind of interesting. I know that we have a lot of readers. Spellbound Girls are great readers. Hollywood just can't help itself. Look at the number of movies that are in the top 200. 30% are based on books, and 17.5% are based on comics. So pretty much half of those are things that have already been written. That's why I was so happy to know that you went ahead and did a book, because that's the best chance to get a film made. Then you add in there remakes, Star Wars, Pixar movies, and other things. And no ideas are coming out of Hollywood. They're coming out of Belmont and Lexington and people who are writing books, and then people will adapt those into films. 2 years ago, we brought our first movie to Sundance, and it was a documentary called Step. And miraculously, we sold it for $4 million, which is a lot of money for a documentary. And then Fox also spent $10.5 million to acquire this movie called Patty Cakes. Now go to the next slide. The total gross for patty cakes was $800,000. So what that means is about 70,000 people saw that movie. You just saw the Stubblebines video. How many people do you think have watched that video so far? 133,000. And without embarrassing Mrs. Stubblebine, who was the great benefactress and studio president of that video, did you spend $10.5 million making that? So twice as many people have seen that video than saw this movie that cost $10.5 million. I'll also add, our movie, which sold for $4 million, ended up making $1 million. And once again, I lose to the Stubblebines, so they're up 2-0 in terms of what they've done. And that is where we're at right now. That when you think about it, my son Christian, he loves Joshua 1:9. Don't get discouraged. The answers to the problems that we have with Hollywood are going to come outside of it, but they're going to have to come outside of it, because whether we want to or not, the screen is the other parent. We can do everything we want to do to take it away from our kids, and we can homeschool them. But as a former homeschooling parent, I can tell you that like by around hour 5, it's like, let's watch an episode of The Twilight Zone, and I'll teach you about McCarthyism or something. And so there's really no avoiding it. My dream, and I've been blessed to make over 24 movies. I've never been able to find a way to present the gospel as brilliantly as Steven Spielberg did in the movie Amistad. So that's the power of the Holy Spirit and just a series of images. I can't think of any other book where someone would pick it up and look at a bunch of pictures and be able to string it all together like that. But once it's there and the Holy Spirit is able to do his work, it's amazing how we can tell the story of our Lord and Savior. And then this is when I first became a Christian in April of 1999. And I come from a Catholic family, and I went to what my father calls a wooden church. And for those of you who don't know what a wooden church is, it's a place full of prods. And for those of you who don't know what prods are, those are Protestants. So that's how Irish Catholics think. So I felt like I was, sneaking into the combat zone, and I snuck into this Protestant church because I had a powerful experience with the Holy Spirit. And I felt like I want to become a Christian, and I want to go to this church. And it was Grace Chapel, and Gordon MacDonald was the pastor there, one of the greatest pastors. Brian Wilkerson, who we have now, is great. It was the first time that I really heard the gospel, because his sermon was about John Newton and William Wilberforce in Amazing Grace. And so if we can just play this clip. This is John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace.
This is my confession. You must use it. Names, ship's records, ports, people. Everything I remember is in here. I thought my memory is fading. I remember 2 things very clearly. I'm a great sinner, and Christ is a great Savior. You must publish it. Blow a hole in that boat with it. Damn them with it. I wish I could remember all their names. My 20,000 ghosts. They all have names. Beautiful African names. We call them with just grunts. Noises. We were apes. They were humans. Have we been
was blind, but now I see. Didn't I write that too?
Yes, you did.
Well, now at last it's true. Now go, we'll go. We've lots of work to do, you and I.
Okay, if you could just pause it there. How many people know the story of John Newton? There's the great Sunday school lesson, which was John Newton was a slave trader, guilty of crimes against humanity. He was a murderer, a sinner, and traded slaves. And he was on a ship one night that was sinking. And he said a prayer to God, and he said, God, if you spare this ship, I'll turn my life back to you. And the Sunday school version of that is the ship came in and he renounced slave trading. The reality of it is his ship came in and he decided that he would be the most moral slave trader in all of England. He wouldn't dance, he wouldn't drink, and he wouldn't gamble, and he wouldn't swear, but he would still trade slaves. And then as he continued to go to church, God softened his heart. And even though the Crown and the Church of England both supported slavery, once his personal relationship with Jesus developed, he knew Jesus did not support it. And so he knew that to truly follow Christ, we have to go against the common culture. Sometimes we have to go against the church, and sometimes we have to go against the government, and it makes us incredibly unpopular, I think, as every single person in this room has plenty of experience with. But I've always thought that that was great, was he wasn't blind when he wasn't going to church. He was blind when he was a Christian, because he thought everything was about external behavior. He thought everything was about doing what the church tells you to do and how to behave, rather than having a personal relationship with God and communicating with him and being salt and light to the people that are sitting to your right and sitting to your left. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know the story behind C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis, like all poor British kids, was sent to a boarding school, and he hated boarding school. He lost his mother at a very young age, and he begged his father, please don't send me back. So his father found a Jesuit priest, and C.S. Lewis actually became one of the first people in civilization to be homeschooled. And so every day, one-on-one, this Jesuit priest would teach him about logic. And Lewis was an atheist for most of his life. And then one of his friends, J.R. Tolkien, extra points for what books did Tolkien write? Nice, good work. It was Tolkien who led Lewis to Christ. And the way he led Lewis to Christ was he said, look, you're a man of logic. There are only three options, because Lewis was very interested in Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. And he said, well, you're a man of logic. He goes, I like Jesus, you know, he said some interesting things, but I don't buy this coming back from the dead stuff. And he said, well, he can't be a good guy if he didn't come back from the dead. And Lewis said, well, what do you mean? He said, then he was a liar. And that's not the kind, that doesn't make him a good guy. And if he didn't come back from the dead, and he thought he did, he was a lunatic. So he was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was the Lord. So you have to make up your mind which one of the three it was. And C.S. Lewis said that night he became the most reluctant convert in all of England. And he got on his knees and he accepted Christ into his life. And I think for us in New England, and Pastor Brian, it's so unbelievable on a Sunday night in New England to have a full room. I'm so impressed with what you're building here. It's amazing. How do we have that first conversation with people without seeming like snake charming faith healers on at 3 o'clock in the morning? And we did this actually with the movie Bridge to Terabithia. I don't know how many people saw this. And this is an interesting scene where this boy and this girl are best friends, and the girl has never been to church. She has basically her parents are from Cambridge. She's a hippie, you know, the dad paints or he writes for the Globe or something. And so she's like, but she's a classic liberal. She's like, hey, I'd like to check out church one day. And Jess is really nervous, like, oh my gosh, what is she going to think of this? And this is her reaction after going to church.
You have to believe it, and you hate it. I don't have to believe it, and I think it's beautiful. You gotta live the Bible, Leslie. Why? Because if you don't believe in the Bible, God will damn it in hell when you die. God, Micheal, where'd you hear that? That's right, conscience. God damns in hell if you don't believe in the Bible.
I think so.
Well, I don't think so. I seriously do not think God goes around damning people to hell. He's too busy running all this.
By the way, that's Anna Sophia Robb, who's a good friend, and she's been in a few of our movies. And she goes to Hillsong in New York, and she's a really devout Christian. And it's unbelievable the amount of hate mail I got for that scene, because it's like, that's bad theology. You do go to hell. And like, guys, things come in stages, you know what I mean? Like, we can't expect to instantly, you know, have someone get this all at once. And for her to say, wow, Jesus did, and as you guys will learn when you become filmmakers, a lot is compromise. You can't get everything in there. Initially, we had in the script, you know, he was like Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King. All he wanted was for people to love each other, and they killed him. And they took that out, and then they also, at the end, when Jess finally comes to peace with the fact that he doesn't have to worry about her soul because that's between God and Leslie. He sets up a beautiful memorial and he says, God, into your hands I commend her spirit. And that wasn't in the final cut, which there's an expression in our house, my wife's from Brooklyn. I went a little Brooklyn when I saw the director's cut. So they did something called ADR, which is additional dialogue recording. So that's your term for the day. Anytime you've already shot something and someone insists that you have to put a line back in, they go into the studio and they record the line, but you just hear the line and see like the back of the kid's head. So if you ever watch the movie, you know, and also they record the I hope they never use it version of the line, which I defiantly still use anyway. And Josh is like, God, into your hands I commend her spirit. And so I was like, well, fine, we'll still use it. And so that was, I really loved that story in terms of a girl's first encounter. I also loved it because it's based on real life. Catherine Patterson, who wrote the story, her parents were missionaries in China. She was delivered by Billy Graham's father-in-law. They were in China at the same time. And because her husband was a traveling pastor, each time they would get to a new town, David and John would have difficulty finding friends. And David finally found this great friend, Lisa, and they were all so grateful. And at the age of 10, Lisa got struck by lightning and died. And they could not make any sense of it. And they went through a complete crisis of faith. And Catherine wrote that book to help her son make sense of it. And also, you know, which is, I think, is a relief for a lot of us as believers, we don't have to answer every question. You know, we don't have to be the Wikipedia of Christianity. You know, there are some mysteries that are so great we don't have the answers to those. If you go to, go back to the list. By the way, Bryant, you're like DJ Master Mix Pastor. You've been doing unbelievable up there. This is also from Bridge to Terabithia, The Resurrection of Aslan. And this, if you just pause it for 1 second, if you ever watch this movie again, talk about an answer to prayer. There is the MPAA is the biggest joke on the planet. There is no way this movie should have gotten a PG rating because it is so breathtakingly violent. And the scene where, I remember we had a friends and family screening, and the scene where Aslan was killed, you know, we wanted to represent powers and principalities, and we wanted to truly represent evil. And at the first friends and family screening, every producer's kids ran down the aisle into the hallway because they couldn't handle watching it. And the White Witch's line, which isn't from the book, but we put it in there, which I thought was great, was she said, "You thought that you could save them so much for love." And those are her last words. And so, true enough, all of the great warriors and all of the men, they're not the two people that stay by his side when he's dead. It is two young girls. And this is where I have so much fun, particularly in New England, is reminding people that Christianity was the first feminist religion, that the people that found Christ at the tomb were women, even though at the time, women were not considered to be historic, reliable people for history. So if we just play the scene, it's another great description of the gospel. We had to give the girls the day off after this scene because it was too traumatic for them.
We should go.
So cold.
Now remember what I told you about ADR.
Killed in the traitor's stead, the stone table would crack, and even death itself would turn backwards.
We sent the news that you were dead. Peter and everyone had gone to war.
We will, dear one, but not alone. Climb on my back. We have thought.
When we were talking about what's important for kids to know, there's a professor at Harvard Business School named Clayton Christensen. And he predicts that in the next 10 years, 50% of colleges will go out of business. Half of the colleges that we have right now are going to go out of business. Colleges no longer look at resumes. I don't want to break any parents' hearts that are, determined to send their kid to UChicago or Stanford and spend $500,000. But the head of the education school at Berkeley, Bob Arum, did a study, and the results were shocking. He found out that greater than 60% of the students who graduated from college, and this was a longitudinal study at several hundred different campuses of different levels, 60% of the graduates graduated dumber than they were when they entered. So not only had they spent over $250,000 and been introduced to all the worst kinds of influences and behaviors, but they had effectively wasted, 4 years of their life. And so the same thing sort of happened in the 1980s in Texas. Everyone wanted to be a petroleum engineer because you graduate with a degree in petroleum engineering, you make six figures, in the 80s. And then there was a big bust with the oil boom, and these people had these petroleum engineering degrees. And I think that our culture right now is so obsessed with STEM, or STEAM, as they try to give us artsy people a bone. The number of kids majoring in those subjects right now, there aren't enough jobs in those fields for them for when they graduate. So I think the most important thing is storytelling and getting people to understand how to tell stories. And Pixar actually has a set of rules on how to tell a story. But there's really only one that you need to know. And it is over here. It's cut off a little, but it's very simple. And it's once upon a time there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. And if you go through every Pixar movie, it follows that to a T. Once upon a time, there was a fish named Nemo. Every day, his father took him to school because he was worried about his safety. One day, his mother died. Because of that, Nemo got lost. Because of that, his father went searching for him until finally they were reunited. So every story follows that formula. And then the final slide is from a professor at the University of Hawaii. How many people are familiar with Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey? This is another amazing thing. If for anyone that's writing fiction, this is basically the equivalent of paint by numbers. And so everything happens. If you think of Star Wars, Luke's on Tatooine. He's in the ordinary world. There's a call to adventure from Obi-Wan. And he's like, no way, man, I can't do that. Then his Uncle Ben's house gets burnt down, and he's got or his Uncle Ben, that's Peter Parker's uncle. The mentor helper, Obi-Wan, comes in. They cross the threshold when they go to meet Han Solo, and they get on the Millennium Falcon. They have their first test at the bar. Then they decide to approach the Death Star. They have their forced ordeal as Luke is learning how to do these things, and they escape from the garbage place. And for the reward, they are all getting organized to strike back. They blow up the Death Star. Han Solo, who everyone thought had deserted them, decides to rejoin them. That's his atonement. And then in the return, they have their big celebration when they all come back. Every good movie follows those rules. So especially for the students here who have to write fiction, if you follow that, Narnia, Lord of the Rings, every single thing follows that. I'll end with one funny story in the tradition of Christian confession. Show of hands, once again, how many people saw I Can Only Imagine? So if you notice, there's a scene in there where the pastor gives a sermon on Amazing Grace, and Amazing Grace is done twice in the movie, and I just completely lifted that from the Amazing Grace movie that I had done like 10 years earlier. I'm like, they're not going to remember. And it worked, right? So, because grace is, like Bono said, everyone talks about karma. Karma's overrated. Grace is cool. Karma says an eye for an eye. Karma says you get what you deserve. Grace says you're going to get what you don't deserve. I like that a lot better. And so that Bono was a pretty good theologian. And so I love that idea of grace, of reminding people that I think a lot of people, and that's what I like, but I Can Only Imagine, the relationship with God. There are so many references to God as a father, and not many people have great relationships with their fathers. There are a lot of people who have had difficult relationships, so it's difficult to relate to somebody where the metaphor is, that they are their father. So the much better way to talk about it is to introduce this concept of grace, that our Creator, there's nothing we can do that would make him love us any less, and nothing we can do that would make him love us any more. He loves us unconditionally. And that's something that we try to get through to all our movies. So Speaking of unconditional love, thank you for the unconditional love you extended me and being late, and I apologize. And happy to answer any questions. And thank you guys so much for turning out. It's usually like my mom and my 3 kids in the audience. So Pastor Brian, and thanks so much.
So we have time for 1, maybe 2 questions, and then
I love what you did with Step and how you took this real life story and made it into a documentary. And I'm just asking, I have some friends here from Uganda, new Christian filmmaker, and he has tons of stories from Uganda. So how do you, if someone has a great story, a personal story, a real life story that happened to them, how do you accept story? Like, do you accept people giving
That was so great to walk in. And by the way, I flipped through that book, and that book is awesome. Everybody should buy it. And that's not just because I have a lot of pets. It is a really good book. Africa is film crazy, and there's a great film language there to begin with, and there's a great oral tradition of storytelling. The best thing to do is to write a book. There are 30,000 books that are bought and published a year, and there are about 200 movies that are delivered a year. So what you want to do is, and the dirty little secret is to get in the New York Times bestseller list, you have to sell 600 copies. So it's not like we could get everyone in here to buy a copy of the book and you'd be a New York Times bestseller. But I think that the work that God is doing in Africa is, what's interesting is the sort of secular folks who usually aren't open to the gospel are open to what God is doing in Africa and are blown away by the personal courage and faith displayed by people, particularly from places like Uganda, where there's, it's a tough place to find hope. So, but again, I think my biggest lesson out of this, and again, I'm not being obsequious, but how radically has the world changed that, 20th Century Fox, which is a pretty, famous studio, bought a movie for $10.5 million that got nowhere near the audience that the video that you recorded over one weekend got. Let that sink in for a minute. That is how radically different this world is. We couldn't have said that 10 years ago. But we now actually have the opportunity to get the message out to more people but you just need to be good with craft. You brought in a great director, and your daughters happen to be amazingly talented. So, and the O'Brien girls look awesome on film, and I think my daughter looked pretty good too. And so, but again, please, if only one thing sinks in with you, I have probably 100 other examples of films that fewer people have seen than have seen your video. Movies that cost, I probably did half of them, well over $20 million. And so I think that it's in our power right now. So just like you were saying about the Uganda movie, do it, and start with, where are your friends from Uganda? I just hate to refer to them as the Ugandans. What's your name? Hey, Daniel, it's nice to meet you. I would start with the Pixar prompt. And I would just, once upon a time, there was a man named Daniel. Every day, boom. And then, once you're done with that, I would go on to Joseph Campbell's 15 different beats. And then you have your story. And then from there, flesh it out. But the worst thing to do is to stare at like an empty page, like a Microsoft Word document. It's much easier to start in by filling in the blanks and then just progressively fleshing it out more and more and more.
Well, Michael, thank you so much.
Oh, Brian, thanks again. Yeah, appreciate it.